Thank you everyone for coming. So our topic for this chapter house is women in the Reformation. We chose that topic because we felt like it was something that doesn't get a lot of exposure, even in conversations and maybe some books that you've read. And so we want to kind of give light to a lot of the women who've helped move along the Protestant Reformation and really impacted it. And so our guests today are Dr. Glahn and Dr. Hannah. They've kindly given us their time, and I guess we'll get started with the first question. Okay. So, Dr. Glahn and Dr. Hannah, can you please tell us about some notable women of the Reformation and why they're important for our discussion today?
So shall we start with Katie?
Yep.
Most famous, considered the first lady of the Reformation, it would be Katie Luther, and she...
First priest to marry was in 1522. They were married in 25, so he's not the first marriage, but certainly the first in Wittenberg.
But called the first lady of the Reformation. So what's unusual is, like today, I have a family and I'm educated, but that would not have been the case for most of history. And so you have a nun with a theological education, and she's marrying a priest with a theological education. And so you have this power couple of partnering with theological training, but also raising, 7 kids, 4 orphans, half of Wittenberg at the table. So very influential because, like when we go to Italy, we sit around the table for a couple hours, and that's where the big theology happens, right? So imagine this, every night at your table is 2 people who are theologically trained partnering together to talk theology and forming theology, and it's the university professor and his wife. He's not just slightly familiar with what he's talking about. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's it. She was highly trained because Katie was given as a 3-year-old to the monastery, or nunnery, which was not uncommon in those days. And she's raised in she's his equal in knowing the languages. And when he was translating the Bible, several reformers did this. They would read their work to their wives at night, and they would serve as their editors, basically. So it was really a team project. But I think if my wife were here, Carolyn were here, she would say that Katie was really a feisty broad.
Boy, yeah.
She was opinionated, and she was adept at compensating for Luther's weaknesses. Luther was a spur-of-the-moment type, impetuous man who was not very careful at all with finances. He would have run the family into debt. But she kept money and invested money so that when Luther came to die, he was a fairly well-to-do man, but he would have given away everything he had. So
he tried to leave it to her, but there was some pushback on that. So she really struggled financially, but again, did better than she would have if...
Yeah. Maybe the best thing you could say about her wisdom is that typically in Germany, when a husband died, the children did not become wards of their mother, but wards of the state. She had enough savvy to challenge that in court and won all of her children. She was a sharp dude.
She's also quite the beer maker, right?
Yeah.
Like,
it wasn't Luther's favorite beer. His favorite, because wherever he traveled, he wrote her all the time. He called her my lord, was his favorite word for her. Yeah. My Lord Katie, or the swine lady, because she raised pigs. Just all kinds, they had a really...
What a romantic.
Yeah. Oh, a love letter from Martin, yes.
Yeah, well, remember, people didn't marry in those days for romance. They thought it was an obligation. And Luther married neither for romance, obligation, or love. He married out of spite.
Yeah.
He just wanted to prove that he wasn't a devil, which means an asexual angel. So he married. Right? And then he says later that he found love, which I think is usually how you do it, actually. Right? You think you're in love, but you're really not. Just infatuated. But he found it. So.
I was in Wittenberg in January, and there was this stream that flows through the city which disappeared for some centuries, but they put it back. And our guide was saying, Katie was so well known for being the virtuous woman in terms of she could cook anything, but she was known for her beer.
Yeah.
And that the day before, the town crier would yell, "Don't anybody piss in the water. Katie's making beer."
Yeah. Yeah.
Was known to the whole world. So they were a little more body is kind of what I'm trying to get at. Like, don't picture this Victorian, pale, frail.
No, she was not that.
She was had mirth and girth, wouldn't you say? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
A little, an ox is, maybe
An ox.
a little close.
She was a tough lady. She was sort of I think, interesting lady.
Yeah.
What about some of the other women? Maybe some of the other notable women like
Catherine Zell.
Yeah.
Catherine Zell. So that's Strasbourg.
Mm-hmm.
Husband's a priest. Mary's a priest, which, was that like punishable by hell? I think it was.
No, it was legally acceptable.
Oh, okay.
She would not really be his wife. She would be his concubine.
Okay, there you go.
And you couldn't marry a lady because there were inheritance problems. And the church went to celibacy for the guys because of that. Because if a priest held property and he had children, the deed wouldn't go to the church. It'd go to his children. So they cut off that. So, but they allowed men to have ladies, and you would rent them, basically. They were your rented person. And you paid an annual fee. But she wasn't your legal wife, and there's no legal connection. And if she bore your children, the price would go up. That was the gripe of Oryx Zwingli. And what he did, when he came to Protestant faith, he married Anna Reinhardt privately. And the city he was preaching in had not become reformed. So he married her privately, but kept paying the fee for 3 years. And that's how he dealt with that problem. Which, not a bad deal, actually, for him. Okay. So other ladies, Zell is obviously Anna Reinhardt came the wife of Oryx Zwingli. When you think of the reformers, they're not living in a safe world. The biggest fear that Anna Reinhardt had for her husband was that he'd be murdered by somebody in the city, some radical Roman Catholic or something. So it was a really stark world. When you study Anna Reinhardt, she's a marvelous lady. Very strong. None of these ladies I've worked on were what I'd call weak, mamby-pamby ladies. They were tough. And they were really literal partners, not dependents. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they shaped their husbands. Katie, Luther suffered from severe depression, like a lot of pastors do. It's common among us because we fly so high on Sunday, but we crash like a vulture Sunday night. And he would walk around and wouldn't talk for weeks at a time, this crazy guy. And Katie would go and put on her mourning clothes, her black clothes, and just walk around the house. And then finally Luther would realize somebody died.
Who died, Katie?
Yeah, he'd come to me and say, who died? And Katie would say, Luther, God died. That's the only explanation for your behavior. And it would shame him so much.
Boom.
She knew how to stick in the knife and turn it, I think that was great.
Yeah. There is a really disproportionate number of noble women in what we know, because if you think, the printing press is just a baby at this point. So everything that's been written pre-Reformation, which just happens to coincide with, that's probably a big factor in this reformer being the one we know. And his works being distributed, within 2 months of the so-called nailing. But, prior to this, people had to copy everything out, and they had to be paid to copy out. So it had to be worth somebody buying. So to have an education, you're typically going to be noble. or to have access to a library, you're going to be nobility. So if you pick up a book like that one over there on women of the Reformation, you're going to see Duchess, Duchess. You're going to see these noble titles, and that's why, because most of the history is oral history, and it's lost. You know, that's true in our country.
What's hard.
Yeah. So it's what we have.
Yeah, the winners write the books. You know, Idelette de Burn, which was Calvin's wife, she was a former Anabaptist, which is oil and water for Calvin's tradition. And she was previously married, so Calvin marries a widow, technically, with 2 children. And I think it was Martin Butzer that came to him in Strasbourg when he was there and told him he just needed to get a wife. So he actually went around and marketed a wife. I mean, he put out the word, he needs a wife, and then people gave him advice, and he would check them out. They rejected. She rejected him, or he her, for one reason or another. One lady he rejected because he thought she was too rich. And if he married a rich lady, how could you be a poor preacher if you married a rich lady? So he put that one aside. It might hurt his image.
Wow.
And they were married 9 years. She died in 1649. They had, well, Calvin and Idelette had enormous health problems. And they had 4 miscarriages, but never a child that lived. But from what I can gain from it, it was quite a healthy, happy marriage.
He actually did the funeral service for her first husband.
Yeah. They were friends. They were friends.
Yeah, and he said he kind of fell for her because of watching her care for her dying husband, and he realized how caring she was for him and for him being sickly.
Yeah. Here's the best, latest one I've read. It's a little hagiographic by Edna Gerstner, John Gerstner's wife, or Jack Gerstner's wife. Just Idelette. It's not bad. This one here I found to be good. And this is John Calvin's wife. You can, when you look at her, she's hubba hubba.
We can't take you
women
anywhere.
are, I mean, they're one would say.
Okay.
But famous women of the Reformed Church, of the Reformation.
Let me make my point here, right? So as you read these names, you have Duchess of Este, you have Electress, Countess, Duchess, Princess, Electress, Countess. Okay, so
These are well, I mean, when Calvin would write, like Luther, at night he would read the portions he was writing to his wife, and she would criticize them. So that they really had a relationship that was, I think, just very healthy. But unfortunately, we wish you knew more about it. We don't. We probably know more about Katie than anyone.
there's another influence of women in the Reformation too, and that is, if you think about our churches today, we don't use the word saints. But if you can think back on St. Valentine, St. Patrick's, like you can think about these saints' days that we still kept from the past. So every week your pre-literate people are learning a biography of somebody. And so when you walk into the Castle Church in Wittenberg today, you will see 8 women sort of in a frieze that would have been there in Luther's time. He would have known who Catherine of the Wheel was and Catherine of Siena was. And so it's not like nobody knew about the women until we had a printing
Well, and Luther
press,
read them. I mean, he was much into German theology. German theology that day was a school that emphasized piety, the inner life, later brother in the common life. Luther read the ladies in that tradition.
St. Anne.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's Mary's mother, so.
Yeah. And that's who he's going to call out to in the...
when tough times come.
Lightning strikes.
Yeah.
Jesus was like 23rd or 24th on the list of the saints he would talk to, because he perceived Christ as cruel and a judge and mean.
That's really important, because in the medieval period and in the early Reformation, God was perceived as angry, a judge. So, and I think that's why Saint adulation, shouldn't say worship, that's unkind, but Saint adulation became important because if you have a person like the mother of Jesus or the mother of Mary or a saint that has done great things, it was understood that your place in heaven would be proportionate to your spiritual accomplishments. So these very special people were close to Jesus. So who wouldn't be persuaded by his mother? So you ask Mary to help you. Makes sense. If it were true, it'd be better, but it makes sense.
Yeah. I guess the next question I'll ask, so to prepare for this, I've been reading about a lot of women like Argula von Grumbach. Yeah. She wrote letters that defended and debated Protestantism in schools. And then there was Marguerite de Navarre, who helped bridge the gap between the Catholic Church and the Protestant movement. It seems these women used their wit or political power to protect preachers and teachers, and were not only accused of the doctrine of heresy, but also of behavioral and relational sin. So how were these women punished differently than the men who were supporting Luther?
I think one way, like if you think about Catherine Zell, she's not sent to jail like her husband is, but part of her punishment is she's living without a husband, and she's worried about him. But it's also, you're not feminine, like you're not womanly in the sense of like a wife's job is to be a mother and have children, and you're gonna send the brain cells that are supposed to be in your womb up to your head. Right? Your reproductive organs are going to shrivel. So just that kind of social pressure of you're not the kind of woman. It's a gendered sort of criticism in addition to all the spiritual, you're going to fry.
Yeah, I think the Reformation redefined it redefined the home.
For sure.
It was truly radical. It became a partnership, a mutual task to raise children, to honor the Lord, and your home became a picture of heaven. It was a mutuality. It wasn't this radical hierarchy that we find in the medieval period, in which your task is defined by functionality. It was defined by being. And that really, really radically changes it. Right?
Do you think the priesthood of all believers was part of that?
When you read the document, I say, you can honestly argue that it is a fruit of that, because the function of the priesthood of all believers commonly for us is egalitarianism. That anybody, regardless of education or position, title, whatever, has equal right and privilege to enter the very presence of God. So the Reformation, the ground under the cross in the medieval period was undulating, and you wanted to be on the mountain peak. In the Reformation, it made the ground flat, so we're all equal. No one is greater than another, because there's only one high priest, and the temple, the curtain is torn. So you can be an illiterate, toothless beggar in Peru, or a wealthy aristocrat in New York City, but before God, there's no difference.
Slave can be a bishop.
Yeah, and you can do the same with husband-wife relationships. The value of the laity just soared. The respect for women soared in the Reformation. And I think as we've gotten away from the Bible, we have seen the negative fruit of that separation, which is sad.
One of the pendulum swings, though, what you can see where celibacy is awesome, and then the family is awesome. And today our singles in the church are feeling like the church is for families. So we don't do always a good job in Christendom of finding that balance, right?
I think we're hurting the singles, because the Bible says that's really the preferable state.
Right.
If you're gifted in that way. So I think we've tilted it. I remember my teachers here saying, get married. And I used to think, why?
No, that's true. That's true.
Your ministry will be better if you're married. That doesn't really, anything other than Jesus is wrong. Jesus makes our ministry. Mm-hmm. Then we collect everything we can to help us. You know, I know I needed a lady to help me. I mean, there's no debate about that. So I needed a typist.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
I got a typist and a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you read her your stuff before you publish it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
reads it all.
Yeah.
Because she's smarter than I. A lady is smarter in a different way. A man is a linealist. He doesn't feel. He thinks, he organizes, projects, but he doesn't have a lot of concern for how it will be taken. A lady really does, and Luther said it this way: the monastery, the marriage is a better office than the monastery when it comes to sanctification, because it's only in marriage that you get your rough edge knocked off. Somebody, if you're a prominent person, you have no criticism. You have adulation. But the lady never thinks of you that way.
If you didn't take out the trash Friday night, she doesn't care if your sermon was fantastic on Sunday.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, my biggest critic and my most negative critic is my wife. I mean, she's really after me. But the lady that loves me most deeply, the person who loves me most deeply and cares for me most truly is her. So criticism and love are not opposites, but that's a hard lesson to learn. Mm-hmm. Right?
Coming back to your question about how were women punished differently from men, I think one of them is if you think about a nun in a nunnery. So here's Katie Luther, for example. She didn't go to a nunnery because she wanted to be a nun. She was dropped off there because her mother died. She's in a noble house. So you have a good number of nuns who were there, not because they want to take a vow of celibacy and have the gift and that's how they want to serve God. They weren't given a choice. Mm-hmm. So when she and some of her friends hear about Luther's reforming ideas, she wants to be rescued out of the nunnery. But if you think long term, what happens to an 80-year-old in a nunnery? She's cared for by her friends. Mm-hmm. But what happens to Katie Luther as the widow of Martin Luther? She's not. She basically gave up her 401k plan. Yeah. And fortunately, as you said, she made some good investments and had some land, but she still had a really tough time at the end. And he tried to let her inherit, and there was pushback on that. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't just. You're giving up spiritual security in a sense. Like that's scary. Like going against the church and question. Are you going to be saved? Mm-hmm. Takes a certain amount of, you have to really be confident you're doing the right thing. And then to be ridiculed that you're not womanly, and then to sacrifice any sort of future care. Mm-hmm. If you love your husband and want him around, he's in jail and you don't know what's happening to him and you're trying to make enough chickens, laying eggs to feed children. And so not all of it, their suffering for being reformers was related to somebody else punishing them, like by jail or by the sword.
Some were burned,
but
some were killed
and
or
some
beheaded.
Yeah. Jane Eyre is a good example. Lady Jane.
Lady Jane.
I read too much.
Lady
Jane. Wrong Jane.
Seymour, Anna Cleves were, we would say, martyred for their faith. Mm-hmm. So there's martyrdom there. There's real things. Yeah. Poor.
Lady Jane is like a movie of Jane Grey's 8 days, and you can see that. And there's a conversation in there where the priest is begging her, like, they're going to have to behead you. We love you. We don't want to do it. But you have to believe that the blood of Christ is like the wine is literal blood. She's like, is he a door? Is he, like, she's doing all the metaphors. Like, you could see them, and it's a well done scene of just showing the tension of, what do you do? This is what you believe.
Last Sunday I was in a church. but they had a bunch of books. So I bought a book on Catherine Parr, who is the 6th wife of Henry VIII, the lady that outlived him, fortunately. But what's interesting about her
No small feat.
is that, she inherited as a 6th wife Henry's children. And 2 of them was Edward VI, the boy king, and later the great queen, Elizabeth I. She taught them the gospel. It's an amazing story of being married to a creep. And yet, in Hampton Court, the palace, this lady held Bible studies. There's a very good book by Weir, W-E-I-R, called The 6 Wives of Henry VIII. Some of those ladies were enormously influential and extremely godly. It's just a fascinating look at life. God is doing things when we think He's not. And who really influences the future? Is it just guys? I think the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And we don't talk about that enough. We don't exalt that office of ladyhood, motherhood that much. And it's the most painful, I think, calling you'd ever have. Kids are no fun.
I guess kind of going off of that, my final question is, have things like really changed for women since the Reformation? So in other words, do women have more influence today regarding the church and religious reform than back then? Do you think things have gotten better? Do you think they've relatively
changed?
Yeah.
I don't know how to put a barometer on the word better, how to judge that.
Yeah.
Because what people countenance as better may not be better. It's a cultural definition. I would rather say, ladies, I read a biography of Condoleezza Rice. There's one sharp dude. They forgot to tell us. I've never heard them say that she has 2 earned doctorates. They just call her Condoleezza Rice. No, this lady was smart.
Provost at Stanford. Oh,
Yeah,
by the way.
I mean, she's in rarefied air.
Yeah. So a couple changes. Like last summer, for example, when the more traditional end of the complementarian camp was using a lot of language on the eternal subordination of the Son, and it was, saying it's coming out that Christ in eternity has less authority than the Father. Complementarian women took to the blogosphere. They weren't invited to the ETS table. The Evangelical Theological Society has like 7% women, but they took to the blogosphere, and like they weren't asked, but they started using their pens. There's a long tradition in Christendom of women, educated women using their pens. It's just the blogosphere has had sort of an equalizing effect that the priesthood of all believers, had in a sense. So it's not, if you measure women's influence in formal power, it's going to look very different from if you measure it in, influencing the people that
Ladies,
writing letters.
Ladies just don't have the access, unfortunately, that has been created and preserved and protected by men. It's, like it or not, it's still a chauvinist world, to be honest. I mean, I don't want I think it is. I think it is here, Dallas Seminary, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Ideally, when you're learning history, a day will hopefully come when we don't have to have a women's history talk, because it will be so weaved in that it'll just be part of the story. But yeah, I think you're right.
Whatever the kingdom is.
We can still fight for justice, whatever. We can still fight. Oh my gosh, We'll be sitting in the kingdom going, what are we in actually?
Depends on your view.
Yeah.
The queendom.
Oh, Linda Martin. Your second career is comedy. I'm just saying.
I think because temperament and talent and the arrangement of priorities are different. Males all people gain their significance by the perception of contrast. And the greater the contrast, the more self-significant you are. So instead of looking about how we're together, we find our significance in our differences, which is a very strange thing to observe, but I've observed it. Why do we put so much emphasis on contrast when we have so much in common? Simply because a lady is restricted from some spheres, at least in some people's thought, that does not make her inferior in any way. It's just the recognition. I always think God placed men over their mates, not because men were more brilliant, but because God wanted to personify the wonder of His grace. It's a miracle that men don't screw it up more, and it's a miracle that women would tolerate such trash. It's a miracle, to me.
And it's always a beautiful picture to the world when men and women love each other in Christ. Like when brothers and sisters are partnering. It's so unusual to honor one another and to model. You can have a friendship that isn't sexual and really truly love each other. And the world, might struggle some with that. Although in corporate America, in many ways, it was easier. It was just assumed I wasn't sleeping with people I had to do lunch with, and I wasn't. And we weren't flirting with each other. It was just assumed that we could handle it. But anyway, we're off topic. What do you want to talk about women of the Reformation?
Actually, I read that a lot of the women, the greatest ways that they impacted was through their hospitality, like taking in a lot of refugees, a lot of priests that were in hiding, like Protestant priests, a lot of the sick. And when they defended themselves, a lot of the times they would say, how can you call me heretical? How can you call me sinful? Look at all these people I've cared for, and you're just kind of like on the pulpit, like ignoring the rest of the people.
That's an important point. I think so often in America, the minute we hear hospitality, we think Martha Stewart. And that's not the kind of hospitality these women were showing. These women are there. There's no such thing as a hospital really till the Middle Ages, right? And so you're there, but their houses become like hospitals, and they're getting really good at caring for the sick because they're doing. You know how when you do a task over and over, like you start noticing patterns. Well, before that, everybody's caring for the sick in their homes, and nobody notices. Wait, if you wash your hands, people stay well longer, right? And so they're.
Florence Nightingale.
Pardon?
Florence Nightingale.
There you go. Yeah. So their houses are full of people. They are feeding the poor. They're refugees. Often bringing fleas. I mean, the price that's paid to love people at that level. But then again, when you have people around a fire with a warm brew and a meal in their stomach, even if it's just porridge, people ask questions. Think about your own dinner table when you have somebody over and the conversations you can have. It's so forming for people. And so especially these power couples, the Zwinglies and the Luthers that are having enormous hospitality. Katie probably had 30 people at her table, minimum. They had boarders that were his students. And so it's beyond just feeding them a nice Martha Stewart meal. It's caring for them holistically and then having time to, talk out their questions. Is God
with
good?
The monasteries and the nunneries closing, which were hospitals. That's where you go if you're sick. Where now do you go? You go to the pastor's home. So Katie von Bora, Anna Reinhardt, Iolette Byrne, Knox's wife Marjorie, opened their home enormously to just about anyone. It was almost a grand central station of care.
You had to be really gifted at management. Really, I'm serious. You had to be. It's like managing a plantation. It wasn't just like me inviting friends over for dinner. I don't have to take my own wheat out of the garden and grind it, and I have a washing machine, I have a dishwasher. It's part of why women today can be educated and have families.
And all of them, I think, except for Anna Reinhardt, whose husband was killed. They cared for dying men in their homes. I mean, Katie cared for Luther, and he had more illnesses than you could shake a stick at. I mean, it's a wonder he lived so long. And you, John Knox's wife, Marjorie, literally watched him die. And Calvin watched It'll Let the Burn die. I mean, those are hard things.
This is definitely pre-nursing home, right? So the huge, you look at 1 Timothy 5, and it, we tend to focus on if you don't take care of your own, you're worse than an unbeliever, and we think that's male gender, but you come down to verse 14 there, and it says if a Christian woman has widows, and it's in a world that wasn't that different from the 1500s, 1600s, when you're bathing people. They're on their deathbed, but it could take a long time, and there's a bedpan every day, and it's a huge part of washing feet. Is caring for people that are suffering and probably don't have teeth. You might have to chew their food for them before you put it in their mouth. I mean, yeah.
Well, thank you. I was wondering, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask Dr. Glahn or Dr. Hannah about like the women in the Reformation, or even just culture or social things back then? No? Okay. Well, is there anything else that you guys would like to add to the...
Nothing really jumps out.
I would say don't be bashful. Your greatest contribution is who you are. Not what you do, it's who you are.
True for men and women too, right? Not every man is a gifted leader.
No.
And it doesn't have to be. The stereotypes hurt both ways, for sure.
Like I say, my wife is my greatest critic, but she's also my greatest defender. And how could she have such negative evaluations and at the same time such deep love? That's a lady. That's the benefit of a lady. Right?
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Glad you came.
A couple more books.
He's got some book recommendations.
Book recommendations.
This one is a hoot. This lady wrote More Love to Thee, Elizabeth Prentice. It is well worth a go.
For those joining us by radio, he is holding up Elizabeth Prentice, More Love to Thee is the subtitle by Sharon James.
These are out of the Reformation, but the last ones I read. Amy Carmichael, missionary. Mary Slessor gave her life to Nigeria. These ladies are, just stupendous. That's Ildelet, and these are famous women of the Reformed Church. A lot I've never known until I got to read them. There's just a lot of good stuff out there.
I noticed the bookstore has a little shelf over there that you put together, and then I noticed Zondervan Academic has a Katie Luther book. It just came out in June.
It just came out. Ruth Tucker did it, if you know Ruth Tucker.
Daughters of the Church.
She's written a lot. And judging by what she has written, I would say it's going to be good. I got it, but I didn't have time to read it yet. This is a good one, too. Feminine Threads. Women in the Tapestry of Christian History.
Who's the author on that? The author on that is Diana Lynn Severance, S-E-V-E-R-A-N-C. Severance.
And the publisher is reputable. So you don't want to, buy from Shadow Press or something. You want a guild.
Shady Press.
Where people are accountable to each other. So they don't get away with overstatement or understatement. But these are good. So might help.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.